We'll start in just a moment, so if people could please grab a seat and get comfortable. Before I do anything else, if I could ask people to turn off their mobile phones, or at least put them on silent if they wouldn't mind. We have the usual protocols here. If your phone does ring, the person 2 seats from you takes the call. It can be really interesting. Okay, I'm just waiting for a thumbs up that everyone's here and we're right to start. Okay, there's that moment of silence which indicates we're ready to start. Good morning, or should I say on St Pat's Day, top of the morning, and would welcome all of you to this 5th plenary session of the Economics of Happiness Conference. One of the things I want to do is to test out some of my doubts and concerns about localisation and what it really means, but we'll come to that. But let me first introduce people I gather many of you already know well. Obviously sitting here, if we go from my left, Helena Norberg-Hodge, Adebayo Akomolafe, Manish Jain and Michael Shuman. Could you please make them welcome? The title of this session is Envisaging the Future. What would a localised world look like? And for me, it's a key question because it undertakes that difficult leap from idea to execution, from theory to practice. It's very easy, I think, sometimes in groups of like-minded people to sit and talk about what you like and what you don't like. I'd like some lights. But the more challenging thing, I think, is, okay, what would this actually mean on the ground? What would a localised economy actually do? How would it work? How would people like us in an affluent first world country deal with it? What does it mean for internationalism? What does it mean for solidarity? And what does it mean for all sorts of other questions concerning the qualities of people's lives? That practical emphasis is sometimes what I find lacking in discussion. I can acknowledge people have great ideas, but when I ask them, okay, what can I do? What will it be like? And how will it work? Sometimes the silence is overwhelming. I don't think the silence is going to be overwhelming today. I want people to feel completely comfortable, as I presume you would, to ask whatever you want germane to this topic. If you feel that your question is silly or stupid, just keep looking back at me. Okay? I'm here to ask silly and stupid questions. So I'm going to move on immediately. I'm going to leave Helena, because of her key role in all of this, to last. But I'm going to ask our speakers, beginning with Michael, if you would, succinctly, what do you bring to this topic? When we see that topic, envisaging the future, what would a localised world look like? What's your take on it?
Well, my take is that I work with a lot of communities, mostly in the United States, but sometimes outside the United States, and take on very specific localization challenges. So just to give some examples over the last year, I've worked in North Carolina over the question of whether a set of dams owned by Alcoa, should be moved to public ownership because it's effectively a way of relocalizing energy, and prove that the state could generate about $1 billion of additional wealth and prosperity over the lifetime of the dams if they did so. And I did another study in Ohio, dealing with local food, and showed that a 25% shift toward food localization would create 27,000 new jobs, enough to reemploy 1 out of 6 unemployed people in the Cleveland region. So I see localization as a wealth-building, very practical economic development strategy. In fact, the only economic development strategy that works. And so I hope I can bring to this discussion more specific examples like that.
Great. Manish?
I think that when we talk about localization in the economy, one of the things we need to talk very deeply about is our understanding of knowledge, how we create it, how we share it, how we deconstruct it, how we reconstruct it, and along with knowledge, how is it connected to our everyday lives, how it's connected to our communities, how it's connected to our deepest passions, how it's connected to our ecosystems. So that kind of vision of localization is something that I really want to explore more, because unless we look at knowledge in a very different way, and how do we create space for all diversity of knowledges? We're living in an illusion that what happens in schools and universities is knowledge, and what happens is life is something else. So how do we move beyond what we have? And how do we then redesign all of our spaces? We're living, our entire world has been, every aspect of our life has been disciplined and designed according to a certain industrial view of the mind and the world. And so how do we, starting with this room, how would we design it, I think, in a way that, and who else would be in this room with us are some of the questions we should be asking.
Thank you, Manish. Manish was also the person who brought us all from behind the desk, by the way. We were all going to be behind that barrier. And I voted against it. Bio.
Thank you. My father used to tell me a story about how things were before I was born. In those days, it's always those days. In those days, he said, we used to sell things by leaving them out of our houses. We just placed our items and then we left. We could, laziness was not such a tense word then. We left and just went to play. And people who needed to buy stuff would just come and drop what they have and take and go. It's impossible now to think of that. We trade and we have barbed wires and we have security fences and we have guns and all that. So I think my take on it is localization is really about a reclamation of the spaces between us. The stories that once binded us together and brought us together. The spaces between us right now are so tense. I mean, on the taxi coming towards to the airport on my way to Australia, I remember I was put in a taxi by the university, and I felt this urge to just say hello to him, or else I wouldn't have, got to know his name or that. His job is to drive me, my job is to pay him, and that's all. But I felt this urge to reach out to him and say, hello, what's your name? And we actually engage in a conversation. Right now, we need a conversation starter. We need to re-enchant the spaces between us. We need to tell the stories that once bound, united us again. That's what localization means to me. Yeah.
Thank you. Helena.
And for me, localization means living in what I've often talked about, writing a song that's called I'm Dreaming of a Walking Distance Future. Because what I experienced in Ladakh, and to a great extent in rural Spain, where we lived for a long time, was still structures that were decentralized enough so that I could walk to everything I needed. And that wasn't just to the shops, it was to the theater, it was to the music, it was to the politics, and that allowed then for that walking, size, that scale, that human scale, which was also at a human pace. Our interactions in those structures allowed us the time that Keba was also talking about, how localizing and slowing down go together. I tasted that enough to be convinced that I was infinitely happier that way. And the evidence is so clear, as far as I'm concerned, because in those very same places, as things have speeded up, and there's the car going faster and faster, and the economic pressures pulling people into the city, the statistics are very clear. The epidemic of depression, of stress-related illness, and so on is there. So I do believe that we have evolved for most of our time in history, almost, this little blip, let's remember that. So I think it's very helpful to realize that what we often think of in the West as just well, this is the reality, this is the way things are, is actually a tiny, tiny blip in our evolution. Our whole makeup, our bodies, as Huang was saying, are made for that slower, more localized, more interdependent life.
Thank you, Helena. I'll start with Michael, if I may, but it's a general question I'd like to ask. Is this whole notion, and I acknowledge what Bio just said about sometimes we're trapped into the patterns of thought that have come along. And one of mine is the old left-right divide. And I grew up on the left of the left-right divide. And issues like choice as opposed to necessity have always been very important to me. What's the difference if someone is middle class and has lots of choices and can make decisions about their personal engagement with the economy based on I choose this, I don't choose that? And they can opt for localisation, they can opt for few travel miles for food, for any sort of economic production. What about the working class person or the unemployed person who lives by necessity? They don't have choices governing their economic life. They do what they have to do and what they must do. How does that reality fit into localisation?
Well, the way that you formulated the question, you imply that the better, cheaper, more cost-effective choices that a low-income person faces are not to buy local or not to invest local. And that is, I would just dispute the premise. In the United States, there's long been a belief that poor people lack either the consciousness or the income to buy what was perceived to be more expensive local food. What was not appreciated is that most low-income Americans live in food deserts. And the food that they face for purchase is at corner store bodegas, or they have to drive very long distances, and the food tends to be highly processed and in the end very expensive. So in fact, farmers markets, which often do have slightly more expensive food than mainstream grocery stores, nevertheless are more cost effective than the corner stores that people face in either inner city communities or in rural areas. And I'll give you one specific example. In Portland, Oregon, several years back, a regional chain called New Seasons, which focuses on fresh local food, they had a big question about whether they were going to build a new store in what was the lowest income zip code of Portland. And they decided to do that, and it is now their most successful store. And what it shows is that even people with low income know the difference between price and value.
Okay. The questions are open to everyone to ask, and then we'll obviously go to audience questions soon, but if anyone else has anything they'd like to say on any question, please don't wait for me to ask you, just leap in.
I would just say, again, the question that we've, for my own process of unlearning, of how I saw the poor, spending a lot of time with people in villagers in India and also in urban slums, that I find that actually if I see, again, the globalization model makes everyone feel like they're in deficit. And we look at people, communities, particularly through the development lenses, always as these people are in deficit. And I've actually found that from the perspective of knowledge, practical knowledge, poor people are much more skilled in every aspect, how to build your houses, or how to fix things, or how to grow things. And so that is an aspect that goes unaccounted for in our measurements that we're looking at. Or there's much more sharing that's happening of resources, again, and that again does not get calculated in the ways we look at GDP and things like that. So there's a lot of richness there that is actually there, and I find that if we really want to look at localization and understand it deeply, there's a lot to learn from those so-called poor people, which we need to bring into our conversations, and rather than seeing them always from that deficit victim perspective.
Right. Just on that, no, please, yes. The reality of the so-called green revolution, Manish, where through, and I acknowledge this completely up front, that corporate techniques of mass farming, of monocultural farming, of the application of fertilisers massively improve yields through, say, the 50s and 60s and 70s. Putting to one side the considerable side issues with that. In terms of that capacity to grow food, say if we take the example of a Kenyan farmer who wants to be able to grow a crop that he knows or she knows they can sell into the European market, is that not a good thing that suddenly that person can grow a monoculture of beans but can sell them in large amounts to a profitable first world market as opposed to focusing on the much lower income base of their own community? Does the question make sense to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Why don't you start out?
Well, So I think it's a huge mistake to believe that the best development strategy that faces someone in the global south is to be in an unequal and yet still paying relationship with a community in the north. Because at the end of the day, any community is going to be wealthier if it is as self-reliant as possible and then enters the global economy to the extent it cannot provide for its own needs from a position of strength. And this is especially true in basic human needs: food, water, medicine, housing. These are things that we know how to do self-reliance in a cost-effective way. You can't do every foodstuff locally, but you can do most foodstuffs locally. And if we just build that level of self-reliance worldwide, that's when we can then invite other communities to just trade with us in a very small number of goods and services that they cannot produce for themselves.
Okay. Yep, no, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, partly to the earlier question. By the way, I also want to let you know, audience, we had no idea about what questions he was going to pop us. So we're quite brave to do this. It's a bit of an experimental thing.
For all of us.
Yeah, for all of us. Yeah. But I just wanted to add, when you were talking at first about poor people not being able to buy the products, that one of the things that we keep stressing is that we must expose the fact that we're paying for our food and our housing and our shelter out of two pockets. Our tax pocket, where we put a lot of money into the center, and our private pockets. The tax pocket is being used to subsidize old processed food from far away, and making that cheaper than local food. And it's not just old processed stuff that ends up cheaper, but even a so-called fresh apple from 10,000 miles away will almost without exception cost less, very often half as much as a local apple. And when I say local, I also just want to stress that we're talking about a shortening of distances. There's no absolute here. We're talking about common sense, and what we're promoting is this direction of shifting. Local doesn't have a defined limit. But then, in addition, this idea that people on the other side of the world that have the poverty that exists in the so-called third world has grown out of colonialism, previously slavery, colonialism, debt enslavement. So over there you've got some people who are not doing so well, and over in the industrialized world you have people who have been monetized, handed lots of money from those banks that benefit from getting them indebted and having a lot of money in their pocket. And then, so you have this completely unequal playing field. It's the middlemen, the giant corporations that benefit by those long distances. Cheap labor over here, people with money over here. So when we think we can do fair trade and really a good project for creating wealth in the South, we really have to understand that working across that very corrupt and very, very destructive divide doesn't make sense. It makes much more sense to help to rebuild local economies there. I hope that makes sense. And shifting the subsidies and taxes here and there, liberating ourselves from those banks, as Jimmy was saying yesterday. You know, it could lead to very, very rapid transition, but that's only going to happen if we, the so-called choir, that I don't think is yet a choir, but if we, the choir, link up across our social, personal, environmental divides and put in front of the noses of our so-called representatives, our political representatives, you're either going to support people on the planet or you're out. We cannot have you supporting the banks and corporations anymore.
Now, Manish, I wondered whether you had a long enough time to digest my convoluted question to have an answer. If not, we can move on. I've got another convoluted one to ask you.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that
in a minute, yep.
You know, it's just maybe the reference points we're using are so different that it's really difficult because I've seen how, and other friends like Devenderji would, the green revolution, the ecological crisis is there, but the question of what people are eating has really radically, like I've spent so many time in indigenous communities, the number of grains that they were eating is just mind-boggling. Now they're reduced to, because they've gone for those that have gone for the cash crop globalized model, they eat cheap subsidized white flour, which is one of the worst, most unhealthy things that we're learning on the planet. And so we think that that growth model has actually given them better. But if you actually go, and then there's other friends here like our Korean friend, you know, that all the different kinds of green, wild things that people had access to, again, have disappeared. And you find that most communities who are going for that cash crop model, they don't have enough green fruits or vegetables or anything in their diets anymore. So, and then we go in terms of their social relationships. Wherever, again, cash crops and have grown, you find lots of weakening social bonds. So what has increased, yes, is the number of consumer goods in their hands. But I think the question we're trying to ask is, what are all of those other things? You know, the ecological part of the green revolution and its damage has come out, but what has it actually done? That story has not yet been fully told.
Thank you, great.